9 out of 10 history textbooks skip this entirely. And the ones that don't mention it bury it in a footnote so small you'd need a magnifying glass to find it. Before the Arabian Peninsula had a unified trade religion, before the word Islamic meant anything to anyone, before the Quran was written down, Filipino traders were already sitting at the crossroads of the world's most valuable gold routes, not as passengers, not as middlemen, as the ones who set the terms. That's not a romantic exaggeration. That's what the archaeology keeps telling us every time someone bothers to dig in the right place. And almost nobody talks about it. Here's the scale of what we're dealing with. The ancient world ran on two things: spices and gold. Whoever moved those commodities between the Pacific Basin and the Western trade networks held enormous leverage over every civilization that needed them. Empires rose and fell based on access to those routes. Wars were fought. Alliances were forged and broken. The names we remember from that era, Babylon, Egypt, Arabia, Rome, we remember them partly because they controlled pieces of that network. But there was another piece, a crucial one, and it sat in the archipelago that would one day be called the Philippines. The Laguna Copperplate inscription changed a lot of assumptions when it was decoded in 1992. Dated to 900 CE, it references debt settlements, trade relationships, and political alliances that suggest a deeply sophisticated commercial culture already in full operation. This wasn't the beginning of Filipino trade civilization. This was a bureaucratic record of one already mature and complex. The document references connections to the Indianized kingdoms of Southeast Asia and implies networks stretching far beyond the archipelago's visible borders. Important. But 900 CE is still relatively recent in the grand timeline of human commerce. Push further back, much further, and the picture gets genuinely unsettling for anyone raised on the standard Eurocentric or Arab-centric model of ancient trade. Look, the detail that reshapes everything sits in a place most people never look: the cargo manifests and material records from ancient Arabian ports. Gold. Specifically, gold of particular purity grades. It moved through Arabian ports in quantities that the Arabian Peninsula itself could not produce. The peninsula's own gold deposits, while real, were not sufficient to account for what the records describe. Some of that gold came from Africa, but a significant and consistently underexamined portion traced back through routes that pointed east, precisely pointed. Far east, past India, past the Malay Peninsula, into the island chains that modern geography calls the Philippines. There's a catch. The Philippine archipelago sits on some of the most gold-rich geology on the planet. This is not disputed. The Cordillera region, parts of Mindanao, the eastern Visayas, these areas were being worked for gold long before any outside contact. The Ifugao and their ancestors shaped mountain terraces that are still standing today, and that civilization required economic infrastructure. Gold was part of it. Gold ornaments recovered from pre-colonial Philippine burial sites show craftsmanship of a quality that demands a long, refined metallurgical tradition. You don't develop that skill in a generation. So the gold existed, the routes existed. The question is whether Filipino traders were active agents in moving it, or passive sources being exploited by others. Think about it. The evidence leans hard toward agency. Ancient Philippine societies were not isolated village cultures waiting to be discovered. The barangay system, the fundamental social unit of Philippine civilization, was built around maritime commerce. Barangays were boat-based communities. The word itself derives from the balangay, an ocean-going vessel of considerable sophistication. The oldest recovered balangay, found in Butuan, dates back over 1,000 years. But the design of the vessel implies generations of refinement before that. You don't build a ship that capable without centuries of accumulated nautical knowledge. These weren't coastal fishing boats. Balangays were open-water vessels designed for sustained voyages. Filipino sailors understood currents, stars, and seasonal wind patterns, the same knowledge that made Arab, Indian, and Chinese navigation possible. Except Filipino navigators had access to the Pacific and the Indian Ocean simultaneously, positioned at a geographic pivot point that no other single civilization could claim. Stop for a moment and consider what that means geographically. A trader based in the Visayas or in Butuan could move goods west toward Borneo, Malacca, and the Indian Ocean corridor, or north toward China and the South China Sea networks. The Philippines wasn't peripheral to ancient trade. It was structurally central to it, a network hub, not a spoke. And here's what the archaeology won't let us ignore. Gold artifacts recovered from pre-Islamic Arabian sites show composition profiles, specific trace element signatures that researchers have flagged as consistent with Southeast Asian ore sources. That research is painstaking and still ongoing, but the direction it points has been consistent enough that serious scholars have started asking harder questions about who was supplying whom. The answer to where the pre-Islamic Arab gold actually came from is not fully settled, but nobody credible is willing to say anymore that it all came from Africa and the Arabian interior. The Eastern connection is real, all right. And that Eastern connection runs through the archipelago. Now, the skeptic in you should be pushing back right now. Because extraordinary claims require something more than suggestive archaeology and trace element studies. Fair point. So consider the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence that all point in the same direction. First, the gold itself and its geographic origin markers. Second, the confirmed antiquity and sophistication of Filipino maritime culture as evidenced by the Barangay finds. Third, the Laguna Copperplate, which proves that by 900 CE, Filipino commercial law was already advanced enough to formalize debt cancellations in writing across multiple languages, involving parties from multiple political entities. That level of commercial formalization doesn't appear overnight. Fourth, the consistent presence of Philippine trade goods in archaeological sites stretching from Borneo to the Malay Peninsula to Sri Lanka, predating any period when outside powers could plausibly claim to have initiated that exchange. Each of these lines of evidence is suggestive on its own. Together, they form a pattern that demands explanation. The explanation that fits best is also the one that colonial historiography had the most incentive to erase. That pre-colonial Filipino civilization was not a recipient of outside sophistication, but a generator and distributor of it. That framing matters, not for nationalistic reasons alone, for accuracy. When Islam spread through the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century and began reorganizing the trade networks of the known world under a new ideological framework, it didn't create those networks from scratch. It absorbed existing ones. The dhow routes, the monsoon trade corridors, the gold and spice flows, these had been operating for centuries before Muhammad was born. The genius of early Islamic commercial expansion was partly organizational, bringing scattered networks under a common legal and religious framework that made trust and enforcement easier across vast distances. But the networks themselves? They pre-existed, and the eastern nodes of those networks, the ones feeding gold and forest products and spices westward, were already operated by people whose descendants would eventually become Filipino. By the way, when Islamic traders arrived in the archipelago, and they did starting around the 13th and 14th centuries in the south, they were not arriving in an empty commercial space. They were arriving in a space with existing rules, existing relationships, and existing players. The Sultanate of Sulu, when it formed, was not a creation from nothing. It was a transformation of an already complex political and commercial entity into a new ideological framework. The debt that the title of this video mentions, the debt Mecca buried, is not a financial debt in any literal sense. It's a debt of historical acknowledgement. But there's a detail. The prosperity that fueled early Islamic expansion, including the commercial wealth that flowed through Mecca and Medina, and later through Baghdad and Cairo, drew partly from trade routes whose eastern infrastructure was built and maintained by people no history book wants to name. Anonymous traders from island archipelagos, sailors who knew the stars above the Sibuyan Sea, as well as Arab navigators knew the stars above the Red Sea. These people left evidence. They left it in hull planking preserved in Butuan River mud. They left it in gold ornaments buried with their dead. They left it in the chemical signatures of ore that ended up in Arabian ports. They left it in the administrative complexity of a copperplate document that assumed its readers understood commercial law at a sophisticated level. Wait a second. The evidence is there. It's been accumulating for decades. What's been missing is the framing, the willingness to look at Filipino pre-colonial history not as a prelude to colonization, but as a story complete in itself. A story of a civilization that shaped the ancient world's most important commercial networks from a position of genuine power and knowledge. And that story isn't finished being excavated, literally. Right now, the National Museum of the Philippines has ongoing work with the barangay sites in Butuan. Researchers in the Visayas are cross-relearning oral traditions with archaeological finds to reconstruct trade route maps that no written record preserved in full. University teams are working on trace element analysis of gold artifacts that could, if the results land where the preliminary data suggests, force a significant rewrite of how we understand pre-Islamic Arabian commerce. This is live research. The conclusions are not final, but the direction is clear. So here's the specific action this video leaves you with. Not a vague, learn more about your history. Something concrete. Well, go to the National Museum of the Philippines website right now and look up the Laguna Copperplate inscription and the Autumn Barangay excavation documentation. These are publicly accessible records. Read the actual translated text of the copperplate. Notice what it assumes its contemporary readers already knew. Notice the commercial sophistication it takes for granted. Then ask yourself, how far back does a culture have to go to reach that level of formalization? The answer you arrive at will tell you more about pre-colonial Filipino civilization than any textbook written during the colonial period ever will. Moving on. The routes were real. The gold was real. The sailors were real. They just weren't given names.